We love a good redemption story, right? The kind where someone turns their life around, finds faith, and never looks back. The broken life restored in a moment of surrender, the clean break, the fresh start. But what if transformation doesn't always move in straight lines? Today on the Good Neighbor Podcast, we're talking about harm reduction, a topic that pushes us to rethink not just public health, but our theology of change. Because if we believe that healing is a journey, not a moment, then we have to ask, are we prepared to walk with people through the long, messy middle? Or should we hold tight to the belief in miracles and the radical 180s? This episode dives deep into how our faith communities often expect quick fixes, like clean breaks, instant conversions, dramatic turnarounds. But what if growth is slow? What if grace looks like showing up again and again, even when the story hasn't resolved? We'll explore how harm reduction challenges our assumptions about morality, accountability, and what it means to truly care. We'll talk about addiction, yes, but also about patience, proximity, and the kind of spiritual formation that doesn't fit neatly into our timelines. This isn't just about substance use, you'll find as we talk through this. It's about how we define progress. It's about whether our churches can be places of sustained support, not just places of celebration when things go well. So if you've ever wrestled with the tension between hope and reality, between idealism and compassion, this episode is for you. This is the Good Neighbor Podcast with Jesse Sidergo. Today I am joined by my two friends, Lorraine Lam, who works deeply with those who often struggle with addictions. She's in many different programs and an advocate in many different capacities. And also another friend, Steve MacDoull, a pastor and professor of history, working on place-based projects in his neighborhood. I'm so looking forward to you all getting to know them a little bit more. So let's get into it. What started for me early on, way back, in understanding how healing happens in someone's life. I grew up very much churched myself. I had church everywhere all the time. And I grew up in a very charismatic church as well. And so growing up in a charismatic church that always believed in praying for someone healing and seeing miracles happen was the goal, the testimony. Like I want to see the person who's addicted with drugs up on stage telling how Jesus changed his life. That's like the model of that's the epitome of it, you know? And the fact that I didn't have a drug story was a disadvantage. That's how it felt. I'm like, I don't have one of those crazy testimonies. And so when I grew up with that, I always thought about transformation in someone's life as this miracle, like a sovereign intervention. The idea of having good habits and growing out of something over time, doing the disciplines and creating a life that is healthy was kind of outside of my understanding of transformation. The idea of transformation as being like this hand of God on me was always in my mind. So because of that, when I went and I worked at a drop-in center, right, Evergreen Center, and I was working with street-involved youth, I didn't really know it at the time, but I had that mentality in working with street-involved youth too. Like I thought that I was going to bring this huge revelation to people, or God's going to touch them in that kind of way as well. And so the conversation with harm reduction was very enlightening for me. I didn't even know the word harm reduction, but I knew I was doing it. Like I knew that it was part of a lot of what we were doing with street-involved youth. And so I'm just curious, when you think about the word harm reduction, where does your mind go? Like, how do you even describe it generally? How do you describe it as a concept? Because it's always associated with drugs, right? But I'm curious, just a general concept of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the term really came about when we were talking about drug use. But literally harm reduction... I'm every time I define a word using a word, I hear my 7th grade teacher being like, you're not allowed to do that. But literally harm reduction is about what we can do to reduce harm in people's lives. It's literally harm reduction. So the term came out of drug use and drug policy, but I think for years. We've been practicing that in our lives in so many different ways, right? Like we wear seatbelts when you get in a car. Like that's harm reduction. You're reducing harm. Making sure like eating healthy is a way to reduce harm, right? Like we know about like diabetes and like high cholesterol, like those kinds of risks. So as much as possible, people try to mitigate some of those risks by, adjusting your diet. Having designated drivers is a form of harm reduction. Wearing a helmet when you ride a bike.
Yeah.
Going to family dinners not hungry is reducing harm. It just reduces conflict.
That's right.
I think like, when we kind of zoom out a little bit, we practice harm reduction in so many aspects of our lives, but specifically when we're talking about like drug policy, like harm reduction is about what does it mean to mitigate harm for people who are using substances. And like, I know the conversation around like needles and like providing supplies comes up a lot, but even providing clean needles is actually like a public health measure that was implemented around like the HIV times, right? To mitigate like the spread of HIV and hepatitis, ensure people have clean needles. And those are just areas of harm reduction that I think have become, really focused on one thing, but actually like, I don't think people realize we're already practicing this in so many ways.
I mean, it goes to a little of the history you're saying with regards to it. I mean, Steve, you have a little bit of a broad understanding coming in an academic way of seeing the history of harm reduction. How have you seen that kind of evolved over time?
Yeah, I think how Lorraine described it is helpful because it's an adaptation to present knowledge and research on what we know. And so now we know that having a seatbelt on radically reduces your chance of fatality if you're in a head-on collision, right? So we make the adaptation. I think when it comes to substance use and the history of that, a lot of our thinking about substances comes from research done on rats. And so a common research scenario would be a rat is placed in a cage. And in that cage, the rat has two options. It can drink clean water or it can drink drug-infused water. And that drug-infused water, probably a mix of heroin and something else. And so if you do that research study, if we were to do it now, there's a high probability that that rat is going to drink both of the water, but it's going to actually prefer the drug-infused water to the point of overdose. So if that was the only study we have to think about addiction, our conclusion would be that substances must have some potency in them that creates dependence and that we will pursue if we even get a little taste for it to the point of overdose. And so that's how a lot of drug policy was, and in many places still is, right? High focus on the potency of drugs. And so if we believe that any interaction with a drug is going to lead to the depths of addiction, then we're going to craft our policies in that way.
Yes.
So Bruce Alexander, and I like talking about Bruce Alexander because comes from Vancouver. So this is a part of the Canadian story. So he's on the east side of Vancouver. And so he takes that experiment that I just described and changes it a bit. So instead of a small cage with one rat, the cage gets bigger. And instead of one rat, there's multiple rats. And so now the solo rat, has this interconnectedness with other rats. It has the possibility of mating and reproducing future rats. It gets nutritious food. There's activities in the cage. So it's not just a barren cage. There's activities. It can do things. It can run on wheels or whatever rats like to do. And it's given the same two choices, water, drug-infused water. And wouldn't you know, it still takes both, but not to the point of overdose. It has a recreational sensibility with the drug-infused water. Maybe some take it, maybe some don't. But if they do, it's not to the same degree because his conclusion is the cage that you live in has a profound impact on your life. If you have stable employment, if you have housing that's not precarious, nutritious food, interconnection, a deep sense of purpose in relationship, that doesn't mean that you will never encounter drugs, but the likelihood that it's going to lead to the kind of use that the solo rat in the cage experienced is diminished, not to zero, but diminish. And so when I think about the evolution of harm reduction, I think about the evolution of how we understand addiction. And so if we're trying to reduce harm, and our environment plays such a significant factor in how we function in the world, then all of a sudden harm reduction means thinking about all the environmental factors that could increase one's probability of having ultimately a long-term unsustainable relationship with a substance. And so harm reduction isn't just safe needles. That's part of it.
Yep.
Allowing people to live another day. But harm reduction then is also ensuring that the systems that are crushing people, and that's the faith angle for me, is like the contending with systems that dehumanize and disturb God's longing for human flourishing. Then harm reduction is making sure people live another day so that we can contend with those systems and decrease the probability of the environment around people dehumanizing them to the point where substance use is a relief from the torment, is a relief from the oppression and the injustice of everyday life.
So then in thinking about environment, that makes me think about people who have a very abstinence-based approach to addiction, right? Because it makes them usually the thought, and how many people I've brought to a detox or a place where it sets it up that the environment, somewhere up in north where it's hard for them to get away and access, or just jail in general, like where you try to withhold that. How does that interact with what you're saying with regards to environment? Like, because some would say, well, if it has a lot to do with environment, then why not just set up why not just reinsert the prohibition? You know what I mean? Like it, and make it so that we don't have access. Why even have access to the water with the cocaine or heroin? Was it heroin?
Heroin, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The thought about that, like, how does that interact with it?
I mean, prohibition didn't work. So that's one thing. But to your point about community, right? Like, I think that whole idea comes from such a punishing lens. And I don't have kids, but I was punished a lot as a kid. And I think what I learned from those lessons was not really the idea of why why my behavior might have caused harm to somebody else or to myself, but I just learned to do things in secrecy. Like, I think that's what punishment does. And so we have like these systems that like don't really talk about social safety nets for people, but we talk about punishing nets. And punishment just generally doesn't work. Prohibition hasn't worked. And so I think the more we try to paint certain behaviors as like, that's not okay and this is okay, instead of actually having conversations about why like something, I just think I think we just need to ask better questions. I also grew up in the era of like, this is your brain on drugs, therefore don't do drugs. And there was like no further conversation about it. But those ads didn't work because people still use substances anyway. I think that like when we punish people and we remove them from the environments that they know, remove them from the environments where they have felt cared for, then you're actually just punishing them with isolation, to your point about the experiment. And like isolation has never worked for people as part of healing. And so I think like for me, this conversation, instead of focusing on like punishment and prohibition, for me, the question also tied to the faith conversation is like, what if we shifted from punishment and prohibition to healing and thriving? And to your point, transformation. And I think oftentimes growing up in a Christian church space, we think of transformation as like the Paul to Saul moment, right? Yeah. Like it's going to be this 180 story. I used to do this and I don't anymore, but it dismisses actually like the process that I believe that Jesus cares more about, and how we human in the first place. And to this point, I think that's why so many people, in my experience, have gone away to treatment programs and they do their 90 days or 6 months or 2 years, whatever it is. And then the program's done and they go back to their community because that's the only place that they have. And so, of course, like you're going to go back to your community. Like, what are you going to do? Like, start a whole new life with nothing? Like, that's really scary and unrealistic. And so when people go back to their communities and this is what they know, of course, like, people are going to go back to certain behaviors that they know or where they found belonging.
Yeah, and in a way, doing the healing in the places where your community is probably most ideal, right? With the rats, instead of like bringing that rat to a detox, or like going to some treatment and bringing them back to that environment, the option of that heroin, filled water is still going to be there. Like, it's still going to be the reality with them there. The other thing, the big political kind of understanding of harm reduction, of the fear of it, is the fact that it is these harm reduction safe injection sites, for example, are actually infecting the neighborhood, or creating an unsafe environment for other people. It's just a thought there that number one, like, whose safety are we looking towards? The amount of people dying there versus the amount of violence inflicted that could happen because a site exists there. The comparison between that is, like, to me, not even close. Like, the amount of people dying here and the, I remember a story, someone getting shot on a stray bullet near safe injection site.
Stray bullets kill people around schools, and we don't go around shutting down schools. Stray bullets kill people around the malls. We don't shut down malls. And so I think it's a very convenient scapegoat. And maybe that's to your point about dehumanization. It's the bigger conversation is about who are the people that are not considered human enough to be worthy of thriving and healing.
Yeah.
And we tend to scapegoat drug users.
It's the most visible. It feels like the most obvious, right? Like, it's so, you can use it as a scapegoat for many because it looks so sinful, for example, right? It looks, and so it can be so easily used as that, right?
Yeah.
Which I find is something hard for us. But in wrestling with that, the idea of environment, if that's the evolution of harm reduction, what does that mean for faith communities as they enter these conversations? Like, you guys did a seminar type training called Faith with Substance, which I think is a great name, by the way. I love that name. And I'm just wondering, like, what is the hope for the overlap between, like, faith communities and harm reduction?
I think we were trying to do what we're trying to do with the broader public. Like, I actually think there's a lot of correlation between faith communities and just an everyday neighbor who's not connected to some kind of formal faith institution, which is, a lot of times we say the word normalization, but I don't think that gets to actually what we're trying to do, which is when you think about drug use, and you were right to comment on this, Jesse, there is a visceralness to it. And our response to needles and blood and the effects of drugs, or some drugs, is disgust. And I would want to say to a faith community, I would want to say to an everyday neighbor that in our evolutionary makeup, there is such a thing as physiological disgust. It's in a way to avoid risk, right? It's built into our physiology, right? If you smell rotten meat, in our evolution is this notion that if you smell rotten meat, don't eat it because it's going to harm you in some kind of physical way. And so when we see needles and when we see, some pretty raw scenarios, it's okay to feel disgust. And I think, I often hear people say that you shouldn't feel disgust, you should feel compassion. But I think you have to contend with the disgust to get to the compassion.
Sure, yeah.
And so
come to terms with it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so there is also socio-moral disgust, right? This is Richard Beck writes on disgust. So there's physiological disgust, rotten meat, blood. Then there's socio-moral disgust, someone who is a part of a different political party or holds convictions that you find repulsive. and you feel actually a similar form of disgust, like it's coming from a similar place, but it's social and it's moral. The challenge with drug use, I think, with a lot of Christians, as well as our neighbors, is they feel both kinds of disgust toward drug users. Not just physiological disgust at the process by which people use drugs, but also a social and moral disgust. And so Beck, myself, would argue for hospitality to become a possibility, we all have to temporarily suspend disgust. Temporarily, right? So you cannot fully
Get rid of it.
get rid of it. But if you can temporarily, in this kind of empathetic imagination, suspend disgust, even for a moment, to come to terms with the environmental factors that shape what we're talking about and all the other nuances, I think we get to better policy. Like, I don't think you should make policies based on disgust. I think disgust makes for bad policies. And so to make policy, to extend hospitality, it's this temporary suspension of disgust so that love and understanding and better futures become possible. But pretending that we don't feel disgust is a bad idea. It doesn't make you less moral to feel it. But I think we must transcend that, even if it's temporary. And I think Lo's done that for me in a lot of ways, through her interactions, through her sensibilities, through her way. And there are many people in our city who are helping us suspend disgust. And it feels gross even saying that I would feel disgust toward somebody. But pretending like that's not there doesn't lead to transformation, I don't think, or hospitality, or better policy. And so let's contend with the disgust and then deal with the nuances of what's going on here and help set up an environment that increases the probability of flourishing. Doesn't guarantee it, but increases the probability. And that is a complex thing to do. It would be easier to just punish people for using drugs. It is easier. If you use drugs, you go to jail. But of course, the environment in jail, as Lo would be able to speak to better than me, is not increasing the probability of flourishing. It is just another cage with its own traumas and isolation. And so often we're trying to solve a challenge by creating a whole bunch of new ones. It's easier to do that, though, than to deal with housing precarity, food inaccessibility, trauma, childhood trauma, present trauma, violence. That's pretty complicated. And yet, to not see those as interconnected into the whole would do policy as well as our neighbors a real disservice, I think.
Yeah, I think about disgust often. Like, I think, I grew up in a church too. Everybody loves the Jesus and the foot washing story.
Yes.
If anyone's actually washed feet, though, like, it's a whole experience, right? I remember, like, when I started working in the community and, like, so I started hanging in the community with, like, a nurse who was doing, like, a lot of foot care for people. And,
foot care.
And this guy came, clearly a little bit shy, but, like, had a close relationship with the nurse that I knew back then. And he, like, took off his shoes and socks. And I would be lying if I was like, whoa, straight to compassion. Because it was not that. And I was like, this is rank. And I remember thinking, I was like, oh my goodness. This just smells bad. It was not a good thing. I didn't enjoy being there. And then, of course, the nurse, Marge, was like, hey, can you come and help me? And I was like, I'll come and help you. But I think, to your point, like, I think for me, like, the challenge in that moment was to be like, okay, like, if I really mean what I mean about believing in, like, the whole principle and why Jesus washed feet, then, like, I need to wrestle with being uncomfortable or disgusted by certain things. And there are so many stories of things I've seen over the years, like maggots coming out of my friend's wound one time. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, I did not know this was a thing. And I say that not to be like, look at me, I'm so great, I overcame that. But it was like, after years of doing this work and being around a lot of specific scenarios, I still feel that like, oh, this like a physical like response. But I think the calling then to what it means to extend compassion and like love our neighbors is to be like, how do we put that aside and like engage with the person? And instead of like punishing the person with bad feet, to be like, why don't you change your socks?
Yeah.
All right. I think we can ask better questions. And I think that's the whole idea for me around harm reduction is actually like, how do we ask better questions to understand the whole of a person and not just the one activity that they're doing? Like if we talk about kids in schools, for instance, if there's a kid acting out, I use that in quotations, right? Like if there's a kid acting out, we might address the behavior of like, hey, why is little Sammy always like punching kids? But we would know as educators and as adults to be like, hey, something must be going on for Sammy. What else is going on in this kid's life that they're coming to school and beating up everybody, right? Like we would ask other questions about like what's happening in this person's life. And I think with drug use in particular, I think we're often just so fixated on the one act of using substances and
One
we
dimension.
don't exactly, and we forget actually like there's a whole person and a whole story behind them. And like, I guess for me, like the whole purpose of that faith with substance space was to encourage us to just ask more questions. I think curiosity is our best teacher.
I think the word that you're using, disgust, relates to me. I remember I was writing one point about the idea of loving your enemy requires that we actually feel like someone is an enemy. Okay. Like it actually feels like they're your enemy. And then you have to overcome that and then love the person. Or else it would just be like love a random person or love someone who is lovable, all that stuff. There's many different things. The fact that it's love your enemy indicates that you have to grapple and come to terms with that person as someone perhaps you don't like, someone that you are threatened by. All those different things has to be felt first, and then you need to apply it. And I think right now what we, part of the social justice world of thinking about peace and loving everybody and seeing everyone as equals and human rights, the funny thing about it is that it makes you feel like, we should see everyone as a friend, we should get along. Don't judge them for that. And we avoid even to grapple with the disgust or grapple with the fear because we're like, I don't know, I'm not supposed to think that. Like, this is a human being. This the inherent dignity in this person should not make me think that. So we shove that aside, maybe delay it, and then kind of put pause on it, maybe with the disgust for a moment and not dealing with it at all, and then engage with it. And then something happens. And then you're like, see, it's because, they're the enemy. You know what I mean? That's why. So in a way, it's like, I feel the funny thing is that in our very tolerant society, at the same time, while we're being tolerant, we're also not grappling with that feeling. And we're pushing it away completely, which is causing us to not have to like overcome it, in a way, sometimes ignoring it at times, which I think it really, the visual picture about like a safe injection site is such a prime example of that, right? Because it's the need to avoid it. Then it's so visual, it's, seen, it's a gathering place. It feels like some would say it's enabling, all this kind of stuff. All that is wrapped up in a place that then you can put your finger towards and see it in a certain way, right? So I feel like that's a fascinating way for us to grapple with this and just to come to terms with it. The thing that got me when I was doing a class on this subject before, and this relates to what I was saying in the beginning, I see this passage in Deuteronomy where it's a famous passage where it would talk about the fact that there should be no poor among you, right? There's that line, there should be no poor among you. And then little do I know, that same chapter also says the poor will always be with you, right? It's like both of them are happening at the same time. And I remember Rick Tobias, who was teaching about this one time. He says, the funny thing is that some people indicate that we should like eradicate homelessness and have these like aspirational, idealistic goals. Those are the people who lean on that passage where it says there should be no poor among you. Because if it says that, well, it means that it's possible. So we should innovate our way to like rid ourselves of all homelessness. And, I'm an idealist, so I tend to go that way, actually. And I'm coming from a charismatic background again, like wishing and praying that miracles can happen and the sovereignty of God can he could just come and make it all good. And then the other side, which I found was fascinating, the poor will always be with you, was what happened to me after my time at Evergreen, where it's like, I can't do anything. I've been trying, I've been praying, I've been like doing every intervention possible. We've had this one-stop shop for everything street involved youth that have health, everything. And it just goes through this cycle. And I became much more jaded, in my understanding of what can be done in someone's life, whether God is in it or not, right? And this dichotomy makes me think of the difference between someone who says like, go to treatment, it's going to work, and you just got to stay away, and then it'll heal you, and you'll be good about that. And then the other side of that's the idealist, right? And then the realist side, which is that. And in a way, the conversation entering into harm reduction is, in a way, do you find that the movement towards, and someone argue if there is a movement towards harm reduction, is a result of us just coming to terms with reality? Like the poor will always be with us. Is there, and coming with that, do you feel like there's a fatalism to it? Like, like a sense of like defeat. That's something, because I think that's in the back of the minds of people who resist it, is this sense of like, you're just going to succumb to it. You're going to just like accept the fact that you're going to give them a needle. Like, you're that point where you're going to give a clean needle to someone. You should telling them to stop, like, because it's possible to stop, right? And I, by default, as someone who is very in control of my faculties, like I grew up in an environment that was very safe. And so I tend to see something, I'm like, I'm going to overcome that. I'm going to, discipline myself and get it. And I usually can, do those things. And so from my vantage point, there's a lot of that sense of idealism that I put on to people who have a very different past than me, and expect them that if they pull themselves up with their bootstraps, and like make it happen, then they can have. But I'm just curious, even in your experiences in watching these things unfold, do you feel the association at all with harm reduction to a fatalistic kind of like acceptance of what is? And where is the hope in that model? And how does it relate to hope?
I think it could be interpreted as fatalistic if this was the only approach.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think sometimes in the conversation around harm reduction, what people are hearing is that this is the exclusive way from here on out that we are going to address forms of addiction.
Mm-hmm.
But this has come out of a response to what's going on the grounds. It's not the only approach, but it's one of many. I've heard our mutual friend Karen talk about helping people stay alive just to the next day, for those longings that people have for people to experience some form of restoration from addiction. I think they're largely earnest longings and are well-meaning. They don't take into consideration necessarily the complexity of factors that make one susceptible or further down that road of addiction. But I don't expect those people to be thinking about that either. I think there's an earnestness there. The best interpretation is there's a longing for people to experience peace and stability. Good. But it's a yes and, I think. Harm reduction is a tool in the toolbox that is going to catch a bunch of folks who might not find their way into a treatment center right away. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But it is another tool that is creating a better possibility that our neighbors live another day. And so I don't want to overestimate harm reduction as an approach or underestimate its importance. but it's one of many approaches. And because we're so fixated on the environment, we're also talking about all those other things too, right? Housing in our city. We're in Toronto. We're talking about housing. We're talking about food accessibility. We're talking about meaningful work that people have access to, interconnection in some form of rich community. So yes, and this is important. It's not the solution, but without it, it's going to lead to an increased probability of harm. And so could feel like defeat if we said, we're going to put all of our eggs in this basket. But no, this is a really important one that was neglected for a long time. And we're also going to pursue other things because we want flourishing in a holistic way. Lo, what do you think?
Yeah. I think, I definitely agree. Like, I think harm reduction, I think maybe this is part of like our society and our culture's desire for control all the time, that we always need things in like neat binaries. It's either this or that, except I don't think anything about life is either or. And harm reduction, in a lot of our spaces, we talk about it as something there's a spectrum, right? Like harm reduction, it might mean abstinence for somebody at some point. But until then what, right? And also I think people don't the practicalities of like, okay, you want someone to go to treatment. What does that actually mean? If you don't have like $35,000 to pay out of your pocket, it's months of waiting for treatment. So what happens until then, right? So if we want everybody to go to treatment, okay, let's talk about the practicalities of how that works. And treatment from what? Like what are we seeking treatment for? And I think people think that, okay, you're just going to go to this treatment center at some point in your life and everything is going to get fixed, except that's not how it works.
It's hard to get in.
And also what happens while you're there. There's also the reality that a lot of the treatment centers aren't actually regulated. So it's like anybody with land and money can just open up a treatment center. And that's when we've seen so many cases of abuse and like more harms caused to people, right? And so I'm not saying that treatment isn't the answer, but I'm saying, to your point, like it's not the only answer. And I think a part that's often missing from these conversations is like people who are substance users themselves are saying this is what we know we need. People who are substance users themselves are saying we actually need harm reduction. So like, why are we not listening to the people who are saying like, hey, like we're telling you what we need? I hear a lot in especially faith spaces where people are like, oh, like, yeah, voice for the voiceless or whatever it is that people say. But I'm like, people aren't voiceless. We're just ignoring them. So like substance users are screaming and shouting, saying like, these are the things that we need. And societally, we've decided that their voices are just not worthy of space. And we're like, no, actually, you don't know what you want, which I think is problematic. And I think the other piece about like, harm reduction and whether or not we're just accepting this as fate. I think about this often. And Oscar Romero has a prayer where he talks about like, we're called to be ministers and not messiahs. And that's always stuck with me. And it was actually like years ago when I started working in the community, a really dear friend of mine, his name is Ramses. He's gone now, he's deceased, but he was somebody that like was homeless, at one point in his life wasn't, but when I met him, he very much was. And he definitely used substances. He was a big drinker. And at one point, there was an altercation that happened. He was assaulted and he ended up being in the hospital for a little bit. And when he was in the hospital, he was not, he had a stable bed, he had food, he wasn't drinking as much. And his whole demeanor was different. But of course, like after his time in the hospital was done, we knew that he was going back to the streets because there was no other options. And I just had this thought where I was like, like what if the best that it's ever going to be for Ramses is that he dies on the street with pants that fit him, and he knew the places where he could go where he would feel valued. And I think that was a really hard thing for me to be okay with, because I, on one hand, deeply believe that like everybody deserves to thrive. But I realized that I was like, oh, I have a picture of what it means to thrive. And that's not necessarily the same picture for everybody. And we can't have this conversation without acknowledging power, right? And I think that like from a more powerful privilege lens, for me, thriving looks a certain way.
Yeah.
And for me to impose that on other people is actually like, it's not appropriate. I would say it's a form of colonization as well, right? And so I think when Ramses died, he was murdered, which I was like, well, that was a terrible way for somebody to die. It was terrible for his friends, for his community, for his family. But then he died and he technically had a place. And so if we're like, everyone thrives when they have a place, I'm like, was he thriving? I don't.
He had a home. He
had an address where he could sleep. But he was still murdered. And so that was, so his life ended tragically. But the person who murdered him was somebody who didn't have stability. So it was just a whole pile of shitty. And I think when he died, I realized, you know what? Like Ramses died knowing who he called his friends. He even made a t-shirt with it one check. When he got his ODSP check, he like printed out t-shirts of the crew. Actually, the t-shirt was really funny. It was like the crew all passed out on the streets because everyone had been drinking too much. But that to him was his family. And that's where he knew he thrived. And these are his people. And so I thought, okay, like if what it means for certain people in the community and for me to be a part of their journey to thriving is that they know that they are loved, maybe that's what it means to be ministers and not messiahs. And I think that's also like shifted a lot in my conversations around drug use. Like I definitely grew up thinking like, drug use bad. Or like I grew up with the church skits where if you smoke a cigarette, you're a non-Christian. Yeah. We all know those, right? And then like all my friends started smoking and I was like, what's happening?
Demons.
Yeah, basically. I was the light. I'm just kidding. But I think it's been a huge learning curve in terms of like unlearning a lot of the stuff that I think the church has moralized around what's right or wrong. And it's always either this or that. And I think being in community with people who are substance users and learning from them, like actually thriving for them looks different from what I think. And that is okay. Again, we talk about the stories of Jesus hanging with, quote, the sinners. We like talk about them and we celebrate those stories. And yet like we have an actual invitation now to like hang out with substance users, listen to them, center their voices, and yet we refuse to. And so my struggle with the big C church is like, well, what's the gap here? If we can celebrate that that's what Jesus is doing and he's calling us to, we have actual invitations now to like do that in our own spaces. And yet we fight so hard against the people who are living these lives that we say we care about.
Why do you think that is, Lo? Like, is it a complexity issue? Like if they heard what the longings are, it would be too complex to solve. Is it a proximity issue that the church or the neighborhood in general, I don't want to just say religious spaces, but neighborhood associations, everyday people, is it a proximity issue that they're not close enough to hear that whisper? Is it all of the above? Is it something else?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have no idea. But I think a lot about, fear. I think that in some of the spaces where I hear people so adamantly against substance users and harm reduction approaches often comes from a place of fear of them being harmed because apparently like homeless people are just out to like get the children. That's kind of like this narrative. Like it's always like my children might not be safe if a shelter is built here, or like this supervised consumption site makes it unsafe for my kids. So there's a real fear. And again, to your point, I think it's important to name fear. I think people are afraid of what they don't know, afraid of the worst possible outcomes, afraid because they've never been in proximity to people. And I think that we are in a reality where fear drives a lot of people's decisions. That's honestly like my initial response to why this is so hard. I do think the proximity is something too. Like I mean, I live downtown, and I often see that these conversations become a little bit of a divide between like the city folks and the suburban folks, right? When you're in the burbs, you've selected your whole environment. You get in your car, you drive to where you want to go, you interact with the people you want to. Like you don't even have to talk to a checkout person these days, right? You get back in your car. Whereas I think when you live in the city, you're forced to come up against certain things, right? And so when you're in the burbs, the way that we've designed our whole space is we only interact with the people we choose to. Once a year for a week, we might do a missions trip. And that's the week we're going to choose to see poor people. That's the week we're going to choose to leave our burbs and do a missions trip and help those poor people and choose to be in proximity with people for a week. And then once I'm done that, I'll go back to my life. And I think that's part of that divide in terms of how we created our environments. We've created environments for ourselves that are super homogenous and we don't know people outside of our own spaces. But I say that to say, though, like, I don't know if proximity is the answer, because then I think sometimes people enter into proximity thinking like, I'm going to help those people, which actually becomes really problematic, right? And I think of Father Greg Boyle, right? He talks about like, go to the margins, not so you can change the people there, but go to the margins so that the people there can change you. And I think that's often what's missing when we talk about proximity. But I don't know. You've got people living beside like supervised consumption sites that are upset about it. So maybe proximity is not the answer. I have no idea.
That's right. But I do think whether you're in the city or in the burbs, the idea of controlling environments around you, in the city, in a way, you have to just roll with it because you're so close with different people. I feel like Steve would have a million things to say about space and proximity and neighborhood. But it's true. Like if that is the understanding of our capability of controlling environments, like it's actually possible to do that. Then when you look at something like a safe injection site, or in general, in harm reduction as a whole, you wonder like, why can't you just like control this? Like, why can't you just like help people follow like a linear line? And what happens in like drop-in centers or places where you're kind of like sitting in the mess of things and it's doesn't look very purposeful, like you have a program getting people out of this stuff. When you have like these hangout places, you realize like people who have their voice to say they need these sites, they're not saying it because like they want like more drugs. Like it's like I just want it, and I want to be in this. Like this is what I want to be in. There's not a whole lot of that, right? It's a necessary step. It's something necessary for them to have to work through. But the thinking of someone like in the burbs, you think like, if you don't want it, just don't do it. Like just get over it. Like and push yourself, will yourself into that place. And I think what I always remember when I was watching a nurse talking about the sites of like how intervention works, is like it's usually in the waiting area before they're actually doing any of the drug or any injection. It's the waiting time that gives the possibility for something to happen. What's going to happen in those many weeks or months that they're going to go into a treatment if they want to do that. You need spaces where there's possibilities for connection and for proximity in a non-like invasive way that allow for the possibility for, getting out of it if that's what happens. But I think it's important to acknowledge that I think there's a lot of spaces that are, I think, drop-in that allow for a non-transactional kind of engagement that builds the relationship, that builds the ability to learn, to hear. And then you'll realize like these are they're in very critical situations that you can't just tell them and tear them away from that. It's very important for us to recognize those things.
Yeah, kind of an emergence of, we use the language of third spaces. There's very few places in a city where you can belong without some kind of monetary exchange.
Yeah.
Right? So the library is one of those spaces, but I think it would be foolish to think that everyone is equally welcome in the public library. I think there are some libraries that are doing a really good job of that. And in theory, the library is a space where you can belong without feeling pressure to buy anything, right? You can be a part, animate that space, right? Third place meaning a place that's not your work, not your home, but that you can find connection over the span of time if you commit to being there. I mean, coffee shops, I live in Toronto's Little Portugal. We've got a coffee shop every 3 spots, but you can't just linger there without spending money. And harm reduction spaces do facilitate a third place environment. And I can appreciate from a distance some people thinking that, yeah, but the commonality here is a bad thing. Yeah, but maybe you have flourishing relationships and interconnectedness in your own spaces. But this is also providing more than just the ability to live another day.
Yeah.
But there is interconnectedness going on here. And what is crucial to resilience for humans throughout our whole history is some level of interconnectedness with the other. Yeah. So this is a place where that can happen. Again, one of many approaches. And I wonder if some of that complexity for churches, listen, I'm part of leading a church. You're part of leading a church. These are complex things. It's hard to know where to focus your attention when we talk about housing and all the things that are putting people in very desperate situations in our city. Yeah. It's hard to know as a non-for-profit or as a church what your contribution to that is. Yep. It'd be easier if you could just give money to something or serve for that week-long camp that you're talking about. But that's not, I think, what our neighbors are asking of us. And maybe what they are asking of us, the church doesn't have the competency or the willingness or the, I don't know. Yeah. They don't have the resources, the experience, or they feel they have no place in the conversation. And for many, maybe they don't have a place in the conversation and they need to kind of bear witness to what's going on. But then for others who are on the sidelines who have a theology that's really compassionate and oriented toward the city, but they don't know what to do, I think there still is some on-ramps for those communities. But I think I'm sympathetic to what Lo's saying of do we want every Christian in that kind of proximity? I don't know I don't know that that's harm reduction for some folks. And so there's nuances there. Right. Yeah. I don't think that's what
abstain. I think that I think sometimes people talk about supervised consumption sites without actually realizing what happens in a supervised consumption site.
Get some of those myths on the table there.
No one's giving out free drugs at a supervised consumption site. I feel like that's so important to emphasize because I think there's a conflation around whoa, we're just handing out free drugs. Listen, if we were handing out free drugs, we would be in a very different conversation because the idea is that the drugs would be regulated. And if the drugs were regulated, we wouldn't have the overdose crisis that we're in.
Interesting, yeah.
So let's do it. Let's give out safe supply of free drugs. But we're not there. So in the meantime, people will access their drugs somehow. In the same way that you don't go to a bar and nobody's handing out free alcohol, right? I mean, maybe they do that for certain events, but that's not happening. And so I think it's important that when we're talking about these sites, I think people don't realize the amount of things that happen in these sites beyond drug use. There are so many people that I know who get out of jail and the site is the first place that they go because that's where they have friends. That's where they can get a new pair of shoes. That's where they have clothes. That's where they can get some food. That's where they can sleep for a bit. Supervised consumption sites are third spaces that people have access to, which I think is so important. The number of parents who I know who call the sites to check up on their kids to see how their kids are doing, pregnancy care, birthday parties. We want people to access treatment. Where are people applying? They're going to supervised consumption sites to apply for treatment, to work on housing. Supervised consumption sites are where I can go to find people if I haven't seen them in weeks to be like, hey, have you seen so-and-so? Trying to get this thing to work out. I think people don't realize that supervised consumption sites are healthcare facilities and community centers for people who have nowhere else to go. the drug use part is a really big part, but it's not the only thing that happens. And so I think that sometimes we talk about things without actually realizing the full scope of what is happening in the spaces. I also think that, like, you know, churches often wonder, like, I don't know how to, like, because it's complex. There's so many things happening. Like, what can we actually invest in? And Jamar Tisby is a writer in the States. He talks a lot about racial justice, but he talks about, like, the politics and the pulpit not being separate. Because, like, ultimately, for me, like, the policies are what has resulted in the reality that we're in. Homelessness is a policy choice. Toxic drugs is a policy choice. Not having livable wages is a policy choice. And who are the people that create policies? Politicians. Who votes the politicians in? People. All of us. And so as people of faith, we have a part to play in terms of what policies are pushed forward. And so I know, like, I definitely grew up in a space where it's like, ooh, like, you know, like, the politics need to stay out of the pulpit. They need to stay out of the church. But I'm like, hold on a second. We live in the reality right now where, like, politics are dictating the lives of the people that, like, we care about. So, like, I think that's actually, like, a very easy on-ramp, in my opinion, for churches to get involved, to be like, this is what we care about. We are sitting in a time where, like, years into a Palestinian genocide, churches can say something about, like, hey, who are the people that we consider human enough to deserve life? And I think that goes back to your original point, full circle, look at that, about, like, dehumanization. Like, who are the people who are dehumanized? And so it's like, whether it's a conversation about drug users or homelessness or refugees, asylum seekers, Palestinians, like, these are all people who are often dehumanized in policies, in their conversations. We talk about seats at the table. They're not at the table at all. And so then as the Big C church, what does it mean for us to have an influence in what policies get dictated? And so I think for me, like, that's a really important part of what it means, in my opinion, for the church to engage with the realities of people. You were talking about your Good Samaritan thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Just when I think about the road, that's like what I think about.
So, yeah.
Good segue.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The idea is, you know, I think a lot of Big C churches have approached justice through the lens of the Good Samaritan, this idea that someone is battered and bruised, and so we must respond to kind of the immediate need. But you would imagine that if that story is playing out every day, there's something about that road that's the problem. So addressing the beaten person is, I think that's part of harm reduction, is actually, like, just responding to what's right in front of us. But then eventually you'd probably reconsider the structural and systemic things going on with that road. Like, if this is a common occurrence, you know, maybe we got to put some lights on that road, or we got to station some neighbors along that road, or there's something going on in the system that is leading to these really poor outcomes. And I think that's partly, when Lo's talking about policy, that's part of the system, is policy. It's a whole host of different things, but you're absolutely right. Like, we have to contend with the person in front of us, the individual in front of us, and what is the most loving response to that person in front of us. And yet we also have to contend with the powers and the systems that sometimes in significant ways, sometimes in subtle ways, are dehumanizing people. And I think the church has often maybe done a better job. I'm speaking from kind of like evangelical spaces, very kind of Western evangelical spaces. We like seeing an immediate need, and maybe it's money or it's a little bit of time. We're willing to give it. And there's earnest people in those spaces who are trying to do the best with what they have. This is not a criticism. And yet when you start to talk about the systems and the powers and the principalities, that seems to get into territory that a lot of us don't know what to do with. And so we need those kind of prophetic voices like Lorraine, who is able to bridge the gap a bit, who knows what the world of Christendom and evangelicalism is, and can have one foot in that, enough to be heard. But also, so much of your life is close enough to hear the whisper of our neighbors, especially many of our neighbors who are being dehumanized by systems and structures.
Yeah, I feel like this could be another whole podcast, but the idea of how to have the confidence or how to feel like you are legitimate within a political system, which we are the voice. It could be even that some people don't feel that, faith and politics shouldn't coexist, but it's also the sense of like a jadedness in being able to feel like your voice even has any difference. How do I begin in that? But I love what you guys are both saying, in that there's a sense of needing to meet the need in person. And that's what we normally think of when we think of doing justice and engaging and getting in sandwich runs and all that stuff. But then there is this side of the structural things that are more distant unless people like get into it fully, and being a participant in that. But I think this particular issue with harm reduction, it highlights that a lot, because it is quite political and you can't avoid it in the conversations. So in a way, where I began with regards to idea of like how this understanding of human transformation occurs in our view of it, I think it's one thing to think like that in a theological sense, but there's all these other things that we need to consider, which I feel like is a big topic on its own. One thing I want to end with you guys and thinking about is like when you think about for yourself many of your circumstances and in the way in which you've engaged these topics, I'm thinking from a lens of someone who is in the front lines for many years, someone gone through many disappointments, and feeling like they're wondering whether their efforts in doing the work on the streets is making any impact, because the amount of deaths that are occurring and the amount of unsuccessful stories, right? When you think about what sustains you both in having hope, or giving any sense of, like this is what helps me reframe, or am I just like a really good reframer, of everything and I can make anything positive, what is it that grounds you in that? And for me, recently I did a talk at a retreat where I was talking about like there's a side of Jesus that I love, which is the incarnated Jesus who came to this world and dwelt among us, and he suffered and he's on the cross, and he gets me, that part I love about Christ. And I think my time working through so much disappointment highlighted that side of Jesus that was like incarnated down in the dirt with me. And then though I also know that, if he doesn't resurrect, then this story doesn't go far, And there is something about that I know it feels so abstract, it feels so spiritual, it feels so distant, but in a way, like, and I have to talk myself into it. Like I have to fake it till I make it sometimes. But it's like, there's the power, there's something there. There's the defeating of death. There's something there that is part of this whole gospel story that I can't leave out. But my view has been so shaped over the past like decade of me, like in that in a way, I just want to land with the suffering Jesus. And then, but I don't know how to access like this risen part of Jesus, like the conquering part. And maybe that's because we're in a time of not yet but I think there's something now, right? There's something should be now, and that's me wishing, that's me hoping, that's me like, and that's what kind of gives me some kind of hope these days when I'm in church and there's like some old hymn being sung. There's always that last part of the hymn that talks about like, oh, Jesus returning, all this kind of stuff. It's like this crazy images, but I don't know why those crazy images get me emotional now more than ever before, because I know the amount of people suffering now, and I long for a day that there will be no tear coming from the eye. I never longed for that before. Like I was just scared of getting in a tribulation growing up. That's all I was scared about. Like, I don't want Jesus to return. That's gonna
Those
be
movies
bad.
were scary.
Yo, those are bad, scary movies. But then now I'm like, there's part of me that moves that direction of this hope, whatever that looks like. But it's hard, and I'm just curious how you guys, whether it's through that or through other parts, how do you access hope in the midst of it?
Okay, well, end the podcast. We just land on a rhetorical question.
Stay
just
tuned.
Play a hymn.
This might, yeah. Just,
and then like the scene from Left Behind.
I can insert that. I can do that.
We have the technology.
I can do that. I can make it happen.
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I'd be lying if I didn't wake up every day being like, is today the day that we're all done with this? And like, sometimes it's a darker version of this at home, and I promise I'm okay. But yeah, it's hard. I think for me, I constantly find myself asking what hope means. Because I think sometimes hope is confused with optimism. I don't know if I'm optimistic. But Justin McRoberts is a poet, and he talks about hope is knowing that things are not the way they are, and then doing the work to try to make it what's right. Whereas optimism, I think, is a passive waiting for things to just be better. And so I think when I think of hope, it's a gritty, like, belief that, like, yeah, this is not as it should be. And so I'm going to, like, do what I can in the movement. And then I also look to the people that came before me, right? Like, the civil rights movement was just in the 60s. Like, it was so recent. I think a lot about that movement lately, in terms of the work that was done then. Did they think they were, like, when they were marching on Selma, did they think that, like, racial justice was going to be achieved? I don't know, but they did it. I've been learning a lot from Palestinian Christians over the last couple of years. Like the Nakba was in our lifetime, just in the 40s. And the people who have been doing the work for liberated Palestine, do they do it, like, anticipating that everything is going to be better in their lifetime? I don't think so, but they would still do it anyway. And perhaps that's what faithfulness means. So I think that's something that's grounding me in terms of what hope is and what it means to be faithful. I also literally think about resurrection a lot. My friend Cindy, years ago, I don't remember what landed her in the hospital, but she went to the hospital and the doctors were like, yeah, that's it. Like, we're going to pull the plugs and she's going to die. And so I was like, what? And then we even, like, called her sisters. They flew in from, like, Alberta. My friend Tikva was there overnight, and Greg Paul, like the pastor of the place that I worked at. And, like, we stayed overnight at the hospital. I was, like, sleeping in the couch because they had, like, pulled all the things. And we were just basically waiting for her body to be like, okay, like, peace out. And then the next morning, there was a commotion in the room. And I remember kind of, like, being like, oh, like, kind of confused. Didn't know what was happening. Maybe it was somebody else in ICU. Turns out it was Cindy who woke up. She woke up and was screaming at the nurses, I need to fucking have a cigarette. And I was like, okay, well, she's alive. She's alive. And I think about her all the time because despite what we had all prepared for, despite all of the things that should have happened, she didn't die. Instead, she woke up with exuberance. I haven't heard from her in years. She ended up leaving the city, went back to Alberta with her sisters. I had heard she was, quote, doing well for a bit, whatever that might mean. And I think we haven't heard from her in years. But I think for me, that's such a reminder of like life is not what we think it is. It's so there's so much we want to be certain about that we can't be certain about. And so I deeply believe actually in the resurrection. And I've seen that. Also, like seeing people come back to life when we have an oxygen tank and people are overdosing, literal like resurrection all the time. And I think those are the things that keep me going, because I think it's possible. I also think that like, I think resurrection doesn't necessarily always mean somebody coming back to life, but it might mean that like somebody gets out of jail and they don't ever go back. Or maybe they only go back 3 times, and that's great. So I think for me, like what keeps me going is a reminder of what hope is, the reminder of movements that came before me, and actual people that I know who are living resurrected lives.
That's beautiful. That I'm thinking about the moment where she came back, just like the power of all of that kind of sorrow becoming untrue, like in a moment.
Yeah.
I mean, that is kind of like the Christian hope, and like the long span of history is that like all of that suffering becomes untrue, and not in a way that it didn't happen, not in a way that there's not still scars of it, but the grip of mourning, the grip of sorrow and pain and suffering just does not have the hold that it had.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a potent, what a beautiful thing to like experience in real time. Like it must be jarring too. Like
It is wild.
resurrection is jarring and surprising, and maybe uncomfortable and strange, and all of the things wrapped into one. I'm hopeful that my friend talks about the compound interest of neighborhood presence. This idea, like the small little things that we do, incremental, and I think movements would lend truth to that, right? There's an incrementalness to it that compounds over time, and I think the Christian part of me thinks, like, I'm coming back around to the Spirit these days. I grew up Pentecostal, charismatic kid, and so it was. You know, the Spirit functioned in a very kind of particular setting.
Yes.
Not in the world.
Yes.
But in the congregated people
with
of God.
flags.
Yeah. All of the things. And I'm not necessarily coming back around to that thing.
Yeah.
Not that doesn't have a place. I mean, we'll say all good is God's good. So if there's good going on there, great. But what I mean is, it seems like the Spirit's up to something in our city. And the little things that we do, when animated by the Spirit, I think can lead to like pretty profound things. And I think that coming around to the Spirit, again, for me, has been just of how desperate the situation is in our city. And so it's a good place for Christians to be, I think, where we're going to like toil in the soil, but ultimately we need God to do something above and beyond our like small efforts to even make a dent on the thing. And so there's this both and. It's like, I'm going to do whatever I'm equipped to do and with the time and resources I have to the best of my abilities. And yet it's going to be insufficient. So I need the Spirit to do something that transcends that, either in the moment or like in the long span, for God to like carry it into the future in some way. And I think that's the faith element for me, the hope element for me, is less what we can do and more of what hopefully God can do in like the long term, bringing those things into God's future in some way.
Yeah.
I think just taking any win and cherishing it is a big part of it in this. If things are incremental, if things are not always like raising from the dead, there needs to be like this, every time something does happen, a moment where it's like, oh, you're not going back to jail. Great. Let's celebrate the not going back to jail. There's those things that we got to take, and I feel like, when we have so much disappointment around us, we need to really celebrate when it comes.
No thing is too small to throw a party
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know. I think about like, I don't know if this is like, I definitely grew up in the era of like, your one calling, like your calling, and then you're going to change the world, right? Which I think is kind of ingrained in this like culture. I think it's kind of like created this sense of like one small thing doesn't matter because it's not going to change the world.
Yeah.
Except I don't actually think Jesus has ever called us to change the world. And I think I've been doing a lot of unlearning about that because like how self-centered of me to think that my actions are going to like change the world. That's bananas. And so I think a little bit of reframing and unlearning of what it means to actually, again, be ministers and not messiahs might shift our understanding of impact. Yeah.
We were 90s kids, right? Like that was
Oh my
that
gosh,
was
yeah.
the message.
Peak evangelical.
Change the world.
Yes.
Which I think it is nonsense.
I think it's the purpose-driven life. There's a reason why that book.
Yeah.
I think in that era, I mean, I'm not like, the book was good. I'm sure it did a lot of people really like helpful lessons, but I think that really shaped this whole thing of like, you are all going to change the world. And it's like, what a completely absurd expectation to place on somebody.
Right.
Yeah, that's just, I don't think that's what we're called to.
You have to understand that me and Lorraine grew up in the
back.
same neighborhood. Okay.
Yeah.
Back in the day,
I heard.
similar schools close by. We were all into this somewhat together. And that was very informative. That, made everything the rest of my life really move from that place of passion of desiring to change the world. I remember walking around the Sky Dome 7 times. I'm not sure if we wanted the walls to come down or something, but we believed something was going to happen in the Sky Dome.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what we were. I think it was a revival. That was a big thing too.
Yeah,
Like, we're gonna,
wanting revival, wanting all these different things. And so I think now just like as we grow, as we become more aware of various different elements in society other than worship gatherings, we become aware of what hope can look like, what we pray for, what transformation can be. And I think this is very informative for us, and I think reflective. This is healing for me too in talking about this to try to shape what we can do moving forward as the church, as people working in nonprofit social sector areas, for us to figure out what hope looks like. So thank you both for coming and sharing all this.
free drugs for everyone.
Thanks,
Yeah.